Hey everyone, and welcome to video 4.2.5 for the Legal Studies Guide. We're almost halfway through this final area of study after a long slog. So, yeah, can hopefully see the finish line on the horizon and ready for that last little push. This quote from John Burroughs reinforcing that idea: leap and the net will appear, aka don't die wondering, give it a crack, particularly across this last couple of months. Make a plan, start actually scheduling in what you're going to do study-wise, revision, and then take that leap, actually do it, and you'll find pretty quickly that you'll be okay. The supports will appear if you take that risk. So today, building off the last video, and hopefully you're potentially watching these in a sequence from 4.2.4 into 4.2.5. We're taking what we learned about the role of the VLRC, or the Victorian Law Reform Commission, and we are now looking at an inquiry that they've actually completed. And using that recent example, we're going to be able to evaluate or give a value judgment on whether the VLRC is good or not at influencing changes in the law. So our essential question is, what is a recent example of the VLRC recommending law reform? And we're going to look at the VLRC's investigation into stalking. So this was an investigation that is recent, within the 4-year time limit as prescribed by VCAR. So this is certainly something that you can use on an exam currently up until at least 2026, but potentially later if there's more developments over that time. So this was the stalking inquiry by the VLRC was a referral from the Attorney General, so it wasn't a minor legal issue of general community concern. It was something that the VLRC was asked to look at by that Chief Law Officer in Victoria, the Attorney General. And the terms of reference were quite broad in a way. The VLRC was just asked to investigate and report on Victoria's legal responses, so criminal law, to stalking, harassment, and similar conduct. And particularly the wording around this was, how could we strengthen or promote victim safety? So we're looking to strengthen laws, not certainly weaken them or roll them back. So sort of guidelines for the LRC, we're looking to strengthen the current laws around victim safety and look at whether the current offence of stalking is adequate, and also look at the intervention order system. So a pretty wide-ranging a pretty wide-ranging terms of reference, which allows the VLRC then a greater boundary or a greater scope to do their work. So what did the VLRC do? Well, you see from Feb 21 to July 21, so we're talking, about 5 months, the VLRC went out and did their, as we've spoken about before, their research. They looked into what the current system is. They certainly looked at sort of what's happening elsewhere as well. And they were able to identify 30 main questions for investigation. And you can go to the VLRC's website and look at these questions in the consultation paper. And as I said, did that research around what stalking is, what are the impacts of stalking, what are all the elements of that offence, how is the current system working and responding to it, what impact could that be having on both victims and perpetrators. And it identified some current challenges as a result. Hey, things might not have been working as optimally as they could have with that criminal offence. The intervention order system might have some issues. Victims might not feel like they're supported enough, and we can look at strengthening that as per the terms of reference. So the consultation paper really closely linked to, obviously, the terms of reference that they've been given. And then we know after the consultation paper, it goes out to the public. And these are some really good numbers to remember, 30 main questions for the consultation paper. But things like this can really help you or help indicate to an assessor that you have a really, really strong understanding of the stuff you're talking about. So the VLRC received 115 submissions. These were from some notable organisations as part of that. So the Law Institute of Victoria, the Federation of Community Legal Centres, Victoria Police gave a submission in around some answers to some of the questions in the consultation paper, and obviously a large number of submissions as well from private individuals. So people who'd been stalked. And a lot of these were provided anonymously because of that reason. They didn't want to put their name to it because they didn't want potentially that to be identifiable to a perpetrator. But really important aspect of what the VLRC do, right, is they hear from people that are directly affected by this law, or maybe the gaps and inadequacies with current stalking laws, which is going to then enable the VLRC to make some really influential recommendations for law reform, right? It's going to allow the VLRC to make really comprehensive recommendations that are meeting the needs of the community and are hopefully therefore also representative of the community. So what happened? Well, by June 2022, so about a year later, the VLRC was able to deliver their final report, and they were able to make 45 recommendations. So another key number to remember, they made 45 recommendations for law reform. Notably, and I'm certainly not going to list all 45 recommendations and ask you to remember them, it's really important that when we're talking about recent examples of the VLRC that we know the broad strokes. We know some of these key figures, like maybe, how many submissions or the large number of submissions and who they came from. And the fact that there were 45 recommendations. And then we can slightly more specifically address what some of the broad themes in those recommendations were, or what some specific recommendations were. And they were that VLA funding should be increased, so quite broad one. That was centred around the idea of ensuring victims of stalking could have support with representation, particularly in intervention order matters. So, obviously a lot of VLA's work is done, and a lot of the stuff we learn about is how they support accused persons, but ensuring that VLA has enough funding to also support victims of stalking. And really clearly, because we are looking at changes to criminal law or recommendations for change to criminal law, there was this recommendation to amend the Crimes Act to make stalking offences clearer and more practical. So this idea that the current stalking offence isn't clear enough. One of the elements of stalking is that there's been a course of conduct, is the language of the statute. Obviously, what that means is developed over time in interpretations through the court. But there was a view from the VLRC that that's something that should be included in the statute, that should be clarified by the Crimes Act of what actually does constitute a course of conduct to meet the elements of stalking. So what's happened since? What's been the response of Parliament? Well, it got tabled in September, so a couple of months later, and there's been currently no action. The government has made some peripheral changes. They've done some work. They've increased some funding for things like, the victims of crime assistance, bodies like that. But in terms of actually adopting the recommendations and actually coming out publicly and saying, hey, we're going to implement these in full, or which is often what government does, right? They say, hey, we've got this from the VLRC, we're going to do all of it. They haven't actually said that they're going to implement it. They haven't said that they agree with the changes. And we don't know if they're going to update the Crimes Act, for example, or they're going to give more funding to VLA. That's still in the dark, and what we're 2 years later. And this is maybe starting to talk to the limited effectiveness of the VLRC in some circumstances. You can go to the VLRC's project website and download and see all of these. I've just included some examples of submissions. So these two here, 1 and 2, are public submissions from members of the public, and you'll note that this person has said, please keep my name confidential because I have an ongoing case, and they actually responded to all 30 questions from the consultation paper. What are the factors that influence whether people who experience stalking report their experiences? Well, will they believe me? Most police are men. I'm a woman. They don't know the experiences that I've had. So these are the things the VLRC was looking at when they're considering their recommendations. This person's submission was 30 pages long, really, really detailed, but the first few pages have been redacted because it was the person's story. So they wanted the commissioners to understand what they had been through to then understand the recommendations that they were making. Now, if you found this one to download, it would have a lot of those pages and a lot of suggestions that you could read, but this story was redacted because it's confidential. There was also a submission from the Victims of Crime Commissioner, and this is a submission from a body called Liberty Victoria, and I'm sure the name of that is in there somewhere. Liberty Victoria's work, which is an organisation that does work in the human rights space, looking at preserving the rights of Victorians, things like that. So it's a non-profit organisation. And you'll see here that they were really clearly saying, hey, we need to be careful about looking after the victims' rights for liberty and security, freedom of movement, privacy, etc. But we can't forget about the accused's right to a fair hearing and to be presumed innocent. So this organisation making sure that when they did their submission, were thinking about maybe the effects of, if you do make the system too victim conscious, too victim supportive, that it could potentially influence fair trial rights for an accused person. And these are the things that the VLRC would be hoping to receive so that they can consider them in finalising their report. In terms of no action from the government, this was an exchange in Parliament about a year ago, back in 2023, between a Liberal member, Georgie Crozier, so the opposition, asking a question of Jacqueline Symes, who is the Attorney General. And you'll see here that Georgie Crozier says, hey, over a year later, the government has yet to provide a formal response to the recommendations from the Law Reform Commission's report on stalking. When will the government table a formal response? And you'll see here that in very good politician talk, Jacqueline Symes says, hey, well, there were only 45, not 46, so you're wrong, Georgie. We're currently working through those recommendations. We're in the process of developing necessary reforms. Hey, we've got Victoria Police to try this trial, etc. And yeah, we might hope to expand that, but nothing on whether they're looking at changing the Crimes Act or anything like that. So that was in, I think, late last year, this exchange. So even now, nearly a further year on, we still don't have a formal response from the government on whether they intend to implement or accept the recommendations, which is a good thing to use in an answer. So we know we need to provide a value judgment on how good something is, and that value judgment can obviously range on a spectrum of unreal, the best thing ever, to complete crud. And we know that our likely answer around the value of the VLRC to influence law reform is going to sit somewhere in the middle here. It's somewhat okay at recommending law reform, but it has some weaknesses, or it's pretty poor at recommending law reform, but it does have some good aspects. So this was a question from the 2019 Legal Studies exam. It actually gave us a recent reform by the VLRC into the committal system. The VLRC is due to report back in March 2020. Evaluate the ability of the VLRC to influence changes to the criminal justice system. In your answer, refer to one recent example of the VLRC. Now, note this skill here says using recent examples. Not naming recent examples, not describing recent examples, using recent examples to do your evaluation. What that means is, in your answer, you need to use the example to support a point you're making. So if we look at this potential sample, okay, and I'm going to go back over these effective, not effectives in a moment. You'll see here that one of the things we're going to talk about as a strength of the VLRC is their ability to comprehensively review an area of law reform. They develop recommendations that are in line with experts and public opinion, right? They get submissions from the public, so the recommendations are going to be in line with community need. And then we use our example to show this. This was seen in the VLRC's inquiry into stalking, which made 45 recommendations after they received 115 submissions, meaning the changes considered multiple viewpoints. So we're using the example and using what we know about the stalking inquiry to further extend our idea of the VLRC being a good law reform body. However, so we're switching into a negative or a weakness. We know the VLRC is limited because they have no obligation to implement any of the recommendations. So it's something we talked about previously. The government accepts ultimate or maintains ultimate responsibility over law reform, which means even though the VLRC can give them, 45 recommendations, 115 submissions, they don't have to do anything. And again, this can be seen. So I'm using the example in the government's response to the VLRC report on stalking, where they have not indicated whether they will implement any of the 45 recommendations. So again, I'm using the example to strengthen the point that I'm making. And you'll see in the examination report from back in 2019, many students did not achieve full marks because they focused on a recent example rather than the evaluation. They had no conclusion. They referred to a recent example, but it was not part of their evaluation, so they did not use it. And this is what we're talking about here. Outline a strength or a weakness, then use the example to show it. What are some points you could make around the effectiveness, non-effectiveness of the VLRC? Well, if the government's asked them to do the review, they're probably likely to want to make changes in that area. And in fact, around 75%, that's a good number you can use, of the VLRC's recommendations are implemented in whole or in part by the government. We know that they can look at it comprehensively. That was the strength that I just had in that sample answer. And it covers public interest, which is important, again, or public submissions, because Parliament is representative. So we're going to be hearing from the public about this. And because they're independent, all recommendations are objective and free from influence or bias. What are the issues, though? There's no obligation. It's a really, really big one. And in this example of stalking, really clear. And that's partially as well because other issues might arise. The government might have other things that come up that they view more important and more pressing. Particularly like a previous example, like the committals one. Then COVID happened. The government was so focused on dealing with COVID, they probably were like, "Oh, we're not going to really do anything in this space for a little while." That's obviously not impacting the stalking inquiry, but society does continue to go on while the VLRC is doing this, and it might have been a priority when they gave the terms of reference to the VLRC, but when the report comes back, there might be other things that the government's interested in or concerned about, particularly as elections come up, and they might think other things are going to get them more votes. The VLRC can only look at things the government's asked it to, so that is a limitation and something that limits its effectiveness. Sometimes all investigations can take a long time, like I just spoke about, which could mean other issues arise for the government. They can be costly, so they might not even be asked. This is an important thing. If they're not asked, they can't recommend or influence law reform, can they? And the terms of reference might be restrictive as well. So we're sort of showing there that the VLRC doesn't have a lot of control over what they look at, which means they might not be an effective law reform body. But once they do have a referral, that's when all of these good strengths can come into play. That's the link to the specific investigation the VLRC did on stalking. I would recommend that you have a look. But yeah, hopefully you now know how to use a recent example to illustrate the strengths and weaknesses of the VLRC. And you can really clearly outline what the stalking inquiry was. Happy studying as always. Feel free to leave feedback.